Hello! For this week's lab, we are dipping our feet into the topic of muscles. As you've already learned, there are some 600 different named muscles in the body. Fortunately, you only need to learn a small fraction of them. In this video, we'll lay the groundwork for understanding how muscles are named, how they act as levers, and how they're grouped together by function. This video is divided into 3 sections to cover this topic, or these topics. We'll start with how muscles are grouped together by function. Your objectives for this section of the video are to distinguish among the main functional groups of muscles, the prime movers, the antagonists, and the synergists, and to describe how the position of muscles relative to joints affects the movements produced. As you should have learned by now, there are 3 different types of muscle: skeletal muscle, cardiac, and smooth muscle. All of these muscles consist of contractile tissues. That means that these tissues are able to produce tension and in some cases shorten and produce movement. When they're producing movement, it's important to know that muscles can only pull, never push. What one muscle group does, another group undoes. So for example, if you think about your biceps muscle in your upper arm and your triceps muscle, so if I'm standing in anatomical position, my biceps muscle is anterior and triceps is posterior. When the biceps muscle contracts to pull my forearm and my hand towards my shoulder, the triceps muscle, which is opposite, lengthens. The biceps is doing the work, the triceps is not. In order for me to extend my arm, I contract the triceps muscle, that's where the pull is coming from, and the biceps extends. So what the biceps does, the triceps undoes, and what the triceps does, the biceps undoes. There are 3 main functional groups for your muscles. You have your prime movers. They are sometimes called the agonists. Their major responsibility is to produce a specific movement. The opposing group would be the antagonist. They oppose or reverse a particular movement. So if you think about the biceps and the triceps, and I'm flexing my muscle, I'm showing you how big my biceps muscle is, which muscle would be the prime mover? The biceps would be, because it is contracting and causing me to flex my muscle, my arm. And what would the antagonist be? The triceps, right? Because it opposes that movement and undoes it. The prime mover and antagonist are located on opposite sides of a joint across which they act. So they're on opposite sides, basically, of my elbow. Synergists are muscles that help the prime movers make their movement. They might add extra force to the same movement, or sometimes they reduce undesirable or unnecessary movement. Fixators are a specific type of synergist that immobilizes a bone or a muscle's origin rather than enhancing the movement of the prime movers. They give the prime mover a stable base on which to act. So if you think about that biceps muscle, you have rotator cuff muscles around your shoulder that act as the fixators. They help to give the biceps muscle a less movable origin. Now, the action of a muscle can be inferred from where the muscle is relative to the joint that it crosses. So if we think about the shoulder joint for the next few slides, you know that it's capable of a lot of different movements. It can move anterior, posterior, lateral, medial. It can even move in a circle, right? And rotate. So if we consider the shoulder joint and the pectoralis major, so this is a large muscle that forms the upper chest wall. It's what people who lift weights sometimes call their pecs. It is anterior to the shoulder joint. And in that position, it's able to cause flexion, so it can move the joint anteriorly. Now, posterior to the shoulder joint, you have the latissimus dorsi, which is here. Its job is to produce extension, so it's going to allow, when that muscle contracts, it allows the arm to move posteriorly. And what about those lateral and medial movements? So remember, those are called adduction and abduction. Abduction is when we lift the extremity away from the body, so that would be like a more of a lateral movement. Okay. The deltoid muscle is responsible for that. That's the shoulder cap, that large juicy muscle at the top of your arm. So it's in a position where when it contracts, the arm goes outward. So when this muscle shortens, the arm abducts, let me be clear, abducts away from the body. Opposing the deltoid, you have the teres major, and it's connected to the inferior angle of the scapula posteriorly and the humerus anteriorly. And when this muscle contracts, that is, it shortens in this case, it actually pulls the arm close to the body. It adds the arm to the body. It adducts the arm. So one thing to keep in mind is, although there are 3 functional groups for your muscles, the same muscle could be part of each group, but just for different movements. So it could be the prime mover in one instance, it could be the antagonist in another, and then it could be a synergist for still a third movement. Now let's turn our attention to how muscles act as part of a lever in the human body. Your objectives for this section are to describe what levers are and explain what role muscles play in levers found in the body, and to give examples of muscles functioning as part of levers. A lever is a simple machine that makes different types of work easier to perform. And you've seen one of these before. Don't believe me? Well, have you ever watched a couple of kids on a seesaw? Yes? Then you've seen a lever in action. A lever consists of a rigid structure and a fulcrum or pivot point. The way that a lever works is that a force or effort is applied at one location on the rigid structure, and it moves a load at another location through the fulcrum or pivot point. So in this image, the child on the right side of the image is applying a downward force to move the children, or the load, on the left side of the image. Notice that the force is connected to the load via a board. That's the rigid structure. And the movement happens because of the fulcrum or the pivot point. Levers are classified into 3 groups depending upon the arrangement of the load, the force, and the fulcrum. So the load, remember, is a weight. It could be something that needs to be moved, alternatively. The force is the effort that's applied to cause movement of the load, and then the fulcrum, again, is our pivot point. In a first-class lever, the force and the load are on opposite sides of a rigid structure, and the fulcrum, it will be located in the middle. So by this definition, the kids on the seesaw, well, the seesaw is an example of a first-class lever. Did you know that a hammer removing a nail is also an example of a first-class lever? Let's take a look. We have a rigid structure. That's the handle of the hammer. It is connected to a load. That's a nail that needs to be removed from a board on one end. And force, provided by the hand, is at the other end. Our pivot point is right here at the base of the handle. It allows the handle to move back and forth to perform the work necessary to remove the nail. Scissors are another example. Here we have two levers that work in opposition to each other. Here's one and here's the other. Remember, I said that a load is something that has weight or something that needs to be moved. So in this case, it's the blades or the tips of the scissor that need to be moved. They are connected via a rigid structure to our force or effort, which is generated by moving thumbs and fingers. Finally, our fulcrum is in the middle. That's the swivel point, where the blades move past each other. One last example of a third-class lever is found here with these people rowing a boat. The oar is an example of a lever. First, we have a long handle or a long stick. Connected to that stick at one end is a paddle, and the paddle moves back and forth to push water out of the way, which propels the boat forward, right? Or backwards. So our load is the water that needs to be moved out of the way, and the paddle, basically, that's doing the moving. At the opposite end of this long, rigid arm here is the effort provided by hands, which are connected to muscles that do the pulling or the pushing to move the paddle. Finally, our pivot point or our fulcrum is the little, I don't know what you call that thing, the thing that sticks up from the boat that the oar goes through. As we row the oars back and forward, they swivel at this point, which would be our fulcrum. Now let's take this to the human body. In the human body, a lever's job is to increase the speed at which the body or its parts move. In the body, a lever consists of a bone, that's our rigid structure, the force acting upon it, which is usually coming from a force provided by muscle contraction. So remember back to our objectives, the function of a muscle in a lever is to provide the force or the effort. Okay. There'll be a fulcrum, which is typically a joint, and then the load. So the load is the resistance that's placed on the bone or a weight that may be carried by the bone. This could be body weight or again, something that we're carrying. An example of a first-class lever occurs at the atlanto-occipital joint. This is a joint, which you see here, that is formed by the occipital condyles of the occipital bone as they rock and move within the smooth facets of the atlas, which is the first cervical vertebra. This joint acts like a fulcrum or a pivot point, as you see here. The load for this lever is the skull, which is on one side of the fulcrum. When muscles like the trapezius, the sternocleidomastoid, which would be coming off this way, and the rectus capitis anterior contract and relax, they exert a force across the fulcrum, as you see here, and that moves the load. In a second-class lever, the load is in between the force or effort and the fulcrum. Generally, these levers increase the effect of the force because it's applied opposite the fulcrum. A classic example of a second-class lever is a wheelbarrow like this one. In this image, an upward force or effort is applied at one end of a rigid object by this young lady. So here's our rigid object. She's able to lift a load located between the force, that's our load here, between the force and the fulcrum, which is represented by the wheel. Remember, fulcrum is a sciencey word for a pivot point. Here, again, the fulcrum is the wheel. We have another example of a second-class lever if we look at a nutcracker, like this one. Here we have two levers that work opposite each other. Can you tell from the picture where the force is applied? What about where the load is? Where's the fulcrum? I knew you'd get it. The force is applied here, where we hold the nutcracker in our hands and we squeeze in order to cut a nut. The nut is the resistance or the load, and then our fulcrum or pivot point is here on the end, opposite our force. Now let's take it back to the human body. This is an image showing plantar flexion. I've faded a few of the muscles here to make it easier for us to see what's happening with the gastrocnemius muscle here. By the way, this adjacent muscle that you see right here is the soleus. Plantar flexion extends the ankle so that it points downwards or away from the body. It's the motion that we make when we stand on our tippy toes. In fact, I invite you to stand on your tippy toes right now. Feel which muscles are contracting when you go up. Also notice, where does pivoting seem to happen? As you know, when we're talking about levers, there's a few things that we're interested in. The effort or force that's going to be doing the work, the fulcrum, where we see pivoting, and then the load. The effort for this second-class lever is what gets you up on your tippy toes, and it comes from the actions of the gastrocnemius muscle. So when this contracts, you go up. The gastrocnemius is attached to the calcaneus bone here. The load that's getting lifted is your body weight, plus the weight of anything that you might have in your hands or that you might be wearing on your body. The rigid object that's part of this lever is the tibia, which you see here. Finally, the fulcrum is right here. This is why I asked you to get up on your tippy toes, because it's hard to see through this animation. But there is a pivoting that happens at the metacarpal phalangeal joint. So that's the metacarpal phalangeal joint. It's the joint between the metacarpals, which you see here, and the phalanges, which are here. In this arrangement, the load is in the middle, and the effort is far away from the fulcrum. Thus, the act of plantar flexion can move a considerable amount of weight. The final class of levers is the third class. This lever is very inefficient mechanically, but it imparts speed and increased range of motion. With this kind of lever, a large amount of force is exerted to produce a small amount of movement. With third-class levers, the load and the fulcrum are at opposite ends of our rigid object. The force is applied between them. So you can think of this as being like a second-class lever, but the force and the load change places. These images show three examples of third-class levers. Here we have barbecue tongs, which are essentially two levers working against each other in opposition. If we take a look, we see that our force or effort is applied here in the middle of the tongs, while the load that needs to be moved is at this end, and the fulcrum is completely opposite. This allows us to pick up food and put it on a plate. The force applied in the middle helps us grip food at the end of the lever via action at the fulcrum. Here we have someone getting out of a car. Do you see the fulcrum or pivot point? Right. It's right here, where the hinges for the car door are. Can you guess where the force is? Yes, the force comes right about here at the middle of the door, which is our rigid object. Finally, what's the load? The load is the door that needs to be moved. And here we have Aaron Ramsey kicking a soccer ball. Can you find the fulcrum in his body? There's actually quite a lot of them, but I'm most interested in this one here at the knee. So this is our fulcrum. Our load is his foot, the weight of his lower leg, and once he kicks the ball, the resistance that comes from the soccer ball. And the force comes from the muscles that help to move his leg. Let's look at another example from the human body. The primary function of the biceps brachii muscle, shown here in red, is elbow flexion. During flexion, the angle between two bones, in this case the humerus, and the ulna, is reduced. In a biceps curl, the fulcrum is the elbow joint that you see here. The effort comes from the biceps brachii muscle, and the load is the weight of the forearm plus any other weight that might be in the hands. Third-class levers like this one are the most common in the human body. There are a number of factors that contribute to the way muscles are named. For example, a muscle might be named based upon where it's located in the body. The temporalis muscle is located over the temporal bone. There are a few epicranius muscles, and they're located on top of the cranium. Remember, epi means on top, so they're on top of the cranium. And then there are muscles like the biceps brachii and the triceps brachii. Brachii refers to the arm. Muscle shape can also contribute to how a muscle is named. You have the deltoid muscle, which is the shoulder cap. It's right on your shoulder. It's where you get a lot of injections. So it has a triangle shape, and that corresponds to the Greek letter delta. There's the serratus muscle, which are in the abdomen, and they look kind of like a saw blade, or if you think of a steak knife, that kind of zigzag looking edge, these muscles look a bit like that, so they're called the serratus muscles. Then there's the trapezius on the back. It looks like a trapezoid, so it gets the name trapezius. Some muscles are named according to their size. So maximus usually means the largest of a group of muscles. Minimus is the smallest. There is a medius in the middle. And then longus means that the muscle is long. So for example, the gluteus maximus is a large muscle. It's the largest of the gluteal muscles. The abductor digiti minimi is a small muscle, and so it has minimus or minimi as part of its name. Some muscles are named by the direction that the muscle fibers or fascicles are oriented on the body. Rectus usually means that the fibers run straight. Transversus means that the fibers run at right angles, and then oblique means that the fibers run at some angle that's not quite 90 degrees, and it basically goes along an imaginary defined axis. So the rectus abdominis, these are muscles that go straight down the abdomen, and because the muscle fibers run straight, it gets the name rectus. The external and internal obliques, these are muscles that are located lateral on the abdomen, and they don't run at 90-degree angles at all, but at an angle kind of in the middle. Then there's the transversus abdominis muscle. So guess what direction that one runs? The number of origins can also be part of a muscle's name. If you see biceps or bi in the name, that means that there are 2 origins. Triceps usually means that there's 3 origins. So think about the biceps femoris and the triceps brachii as examples of that. Finally, we have the location of attachments. So some muscles are named according to the point of origin and insertion. The best example of this is the sternocleidomastoid. Anytime you see a muscle that is named for the locations of its attachments, the origin is always first and the insertions are last. So for the sternocleidomastoid, it has two origins, one at the sternum and one at the clavicle. The clavicle is where the cleido comes from. And then the insertion is actually on the mastoid process of the skull. Then there's muscle action. So some muscles are named for the actions that they produce. They might have flexor or extensor in their name, like the extensor digitorum. Can you guess what that muscle does? Right, it's involved in extending the fingers. And then there's the flexor digitorum superficialis. Right, it's going to be flexing the digits. Sometimes several criteria can be combined. So the extensor carpi radialis longus muscle, extensor means that it extends, carpi means wrist, radialis means radius, and then longus means that it's a long muscle. Now, remember that we said that muscles are made up of cells called muscle fibers, and that the muscle fibers are bundled together into fascicles. So all of your skeletal muscles consist of fascicles, and the arrangements of the fascicles varies. This results in muscles that have different shapes and functional capabilities. Some of the most common patterns of arrangement are worth knowing, especially the circular arrangement. So in the circular arrangement, your fascicles are arranged in a circle, and the muscles that have this kind of arrangement usually have the name orbicularis in it. So the orbicularis oculi and orbicularis oris are going to be muscles where the fascicles are arranged in a circle. I like to think of orbits when I think of orbicularis because orbits remind me of things moving in circles. Some muscles will have fascicles that are convergent, so we'll have a broad origin like you see here for the pectoralis major, but then it all converges on a single tendon, which is part of the insertion. Some muscles have fascicles that are arranged in a parallel fashion, and this gives us like a strap-like muscle. The one that you need to know is the sartorius. Looks like this, located here it goes across the thigh. So it has parallel fascicles. Some muscles have a spindle shape, and these are called fusiform. So the biceps brachii, it has two heads, two origins, which you can see here, but the muscle overall is spindle shaped. So this shape is called a spindle shape. Looks a little bit like a seed. Pinnate muscles look a bit like feathers to me. So you have short fascicles and they're attached obliquely to a central tendon that runs the length of the muscle. So this is a unipinnate muscle. This is the extensor digitorum. And what I hope you can see is here's the tendon and then the short fascicles coming off to the side. So this again looks like a feather to me. That's how I think of it. And in your unipinnate muscles, the fascicles are only attached to one side. Guess what bipinnate means? Right. Bipinnate means that we're going to have that tendon, but the fascicles will attach to both sides of the tendon. So the rectus femoris is an example of this. Multipinnate means that we're going to have lots of feathers that insert into one tendon, kind of like the deltoid. So here you can see the tendons running in this direction, the fascicles attached to both sides. There's more than one, and they're all converging on one tendon. This is a bit different from the convergent arrangement that we saw because we have multiple multiple tendons with their fascicles attached. So again, your most common patterns of fascicle arrangement are going to be circular, convergent, parallel, fusiform, and pinnate. The fascicles and their arrangement determines a muscle's range of motion or how much movement there is in a muscle when the muscle shortens. Your fascicles also determine how much power there is in a muscle. Long fibers are able to contract along their long axis more, but they're usually not very powerful. Your power actually depends upon the number of muscle fibers. Since your bipinnate and multipinnate muscles have the most muscle fibers, they may only shorten a little because they're short fibers, but there's a lot more power to their contraction. So I know this was a long video, but we've really covered a lot of information. We've talked about how muscles are grouped functionally. Remember, you have the prime movers, which are muscles that are primarily responsible for a specific type of movement in the body. You have the antagonists, which are the muscle groups that work against the prime movers, and you have the synergists. What do the synergists do? These are supporting muscles that help create movement. We talked about how muscles function as sources for effort or force in your first, second, and third class levers in the body. And we also talked about how muscles are named in the body. And I've given some examples. My hope with this last part of the video is that you've picked up some clues on how muscles and their locations and their functions are related to their names, so that when you see names in your future career, you'll be able to kind of guess what the function or the shape or the location of a particular muscle is. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me by email or text. You can always drop into an office hour as well. I'm happy to see you. So, good luck with your studying, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye now.